welcome to the Australian Studies program. As you are aware that we have a course on government and politics in Australia, and this course is part of the BDP program, and we have very important issues to discuss in today's program. And the title of the program today we are going to present is Australia's political system and foreign relations. And this program we will very briefly discuss some of the important issues relating to the Australia and Australian political institutions and some of the important events that have taken place in the history of Australia's political institutions and the relations in the region, and also some of the important issues in foreign policy and also globalization. Today we have with us very distinguished professor from the University of Western Australia, Professor Danish Ramlee. Professor Ramlee is visiting professor to number of universities apart from his the teaching there in University of Western Australia. Recently he was visiting professor to the University of Tokyo. Professor Ramlee, you are welcome to IGNOU's Australian Studies program. And today we are very happy to have you here on this program, and I ask you to some of the very important issues relating to our Australian Studies program, and especially for the course Government and Politics in Australia. I invite you to answer some of our important questions. In the first instance, I am going to ask you, what are some of the current political implications of Australia's cultural colonial heritage?
That's a very interesting question, Professor Gopal. Perhaps I could answer that in a number of ways. I think maybe the first thing that I would like to say in response to that is that if you look at Australia's current political map, the political boundaries of Australia internally, and also the names of each of the states and territories, you realise very quickly, at least I do, is that what we have in Australia is a colonial political map. So we still have a colonial political map in Australia. The boundaries themselves were not drawn in Australia, they were drawn in Whitehall, like many of the boundaries of colonies around, British colonies around the world. Like India, of course, yes, we did enjoy British colonial rule. But if you look at the names of each of the states and territories, fairly obviously, if you begin to analyse them, we still have Queensland, we have Victoria, and historically as well, I would suggest that there's always been a direct opposition between Victoria and New South Wales, New South Wales being the equivalent of the working class coal mining district in the southern part of Wales in the United Kingdom. So we've always had within Australia an opposition between Victoria and New South Wales. And traditionally, if you look at the history of the political parties in Australia and the political party leadership, normally what you find in the last several decades at least is that the leader of the Australian Labor Party invariably comes from New South Wales, the Labor state as it were, and the leader of the Conservative Liberal Party, so-called, generally comes from the state of Victoria. That is the normal case, I would suggest. However, recently, since the election of Prime Minister Howard in 1996, John Howard is actually from New South Wales, and the most recent, apart from the current one, the most recent leader of the Labor Party was from Victoria. So up until very recently, we've had that New South Wales-Victoria expectation turned on its head. However, the current Labor leader is from New South Wales. The Australian election is due to take place sometime this year. The deputy leader of the Liberal Party is from Victoria. So it may well be that later on this year this normal state of affairs actually goes back, this normal state of affairs is actually back to what it was some years back. Part of that colonial conflict as well between Victoria and New South Wales is also reflected in the location of the capital city. The Australian Constitution even specifies that the Australian capital city should be a distance from Melbourne and a distance from Sydney, which is an unusual thing for a constitution to specify. And of course, before the creation of Canberra, the federal capital of Australia was in Melbourne. So Melbourne still has this residual feel that it really should be the capital of Australia, and Sydney really should also be the capital. Of course it is in terms of its finance and so on. So the capital is actually located between the two. So the that early colonial opposition is also reflected even in the location of the capital city. And thirdly, I think also those tensions between Victoria and New South Wales to some extent are reflected around the rest of the country as well, that there's a centre or a core of capital, a centre or a core within the southeastern corner of Australia, which is similar to the centre of power in the southeastern part of England. And so we have almost a kind of a replication of the distribution of power in England in Australia, that the power is in the southeast corner, the rest of the country is relatively unimportant, and if you look at the names of the rest of the country in Australia, you have Northern Territory, Western Australia, South Australia, all of those names imply relative unimportance. A fourth point that I'd like to suggest is that those political party differences that I've mentioned play themselves out historically at the state level as well. And so New South Wales at the state level tends to be a Labor state. Victoria at the state level often is a Liberal state, but not always. I think a couple of other points, if I could, just to round off that. We've had, of course, as many of you will know, a Republican referendum in Australia 5 years back in 1999. And as you also may know, the Republic referendum failed. It failed because the question was phrased in such a way that it was destined to fail. But one of the interesting things about the colonial political map and the nature of the no vote in that referendum was that the highest no vote was, not surprisingly perhaps, in Queensland. Two more points as well. We had a referendum in 1977 on the national song. Now, up until 1977, our national anthem was still God Save the Queen. So we were still, up until 20 years or so back, 25 years or so ago, still had the same national anthem as the United Kingdom. That referendum chose Advance Australia Fair in 1977, but it wasn't until 1984 that eventually Advance Australia Fair became the national anthem of Australia, and the national colours were also formalised in 1984. So really, up until 20 years back, we still had the same national anthem as the United Kingdom. And one final point, I noticed that the stone of this place was laid on the 26th of January, the same national day as Australia. India and Australia share the same national day. However, in the Australian context, that national day is also a colonial relic, in the sense that it represents the landing of the British to take over Australia. So even our national day to this day still is a colonial relic.
Professor Dennis, for the benefit of students, could you please describe the contemporary structure of the political system of contemporary Australia and the political institutions of the Australian the society?
Even now, carrying on from that earlier point, even now the Queen has her representative in Australia, the Governor-General. Each of the states contains the Queen's representative. That is, each of the states has a governor. In other words, the essential basis of our political system and our main political institutions even now is semi-colonial. Of course, Parliament rules. We, like India, have a federal parliamentary system. Each of the states has a state government. But nonetheless, that colonial structure of government represented by the Queen's representatives, Governor-General at the federal level, governors at the state level, is still an important element there, and was particularly important during the Whitlam administration, which occurred between 1972 and 1975. It was particularly important because on November the 11th, 1975, the Queen's representative, that is the Governor-General, dismissed the formerly elected government from office. And Malcolm Fraser was elected at the subsequent election as the Prime Minister. So even up until, again, in the last 30 years, the Queen's representative has an important impact upon the nature of the federal electoral system. And when we look at the electoral system, the federal parliament comprises a Senate similar to the American system, the lower house, the House of Representatives, similar to the American system. Each of the states has a lower house, the House of the House of Assembly, but not all of the states have an upper house. Some of the states have a legislative council. Western Australia has a legislative council and upper house. Queensland does not have a legislative council, but all of the states have a legislative assembly. Also, one interesting thing about the Australian Constitution is that federal representation is fairly equal. In other words, it's based on a population basis. So representation at the House of Representatives at the lower house is based essentially on equal population, apart from the interesting case of Tasmania. Tasmania is guaranteed by the Australian Constitution to have a minimum representation of 5 representatives, which effectively means that given the structure of population in the Australian state, that Tasmania is overrepresented because of the nature of the Constitution.
Here, you have, for each state separate constitution.
Each of the states has its own constitution.
Yeah. How do you see that, as far as governance of Australia is concerned, how the center and the state relations, they on issues of the national importance, especially on the question of foreign policy, how the state have the impact on the center's policies?
That's a very interesting one. The nature of the constitutional setup in Australia gives some powers to the centre, to the federal government, and some other powers to the states. Effectively, what that means is, in practice at least, that the centre, the federal government, takes charge of national issues such as defence, such as economic policy, and so on. However, each of the states, as they were constituted as colonial entities in the earliest days, effectively became almost 6 economies. So in a sense you've got a national economy, but you've still got a number of regional economies under there. So the economic policy has always been an issue, partly because of the nature of the Constitution and partly because of the historical growth of each of the economies within Australia. But constitutionally, some powers are particularly important in terms of the distribution of income within Australia. Particularly, each of the states possesses so-called minerals power. Effectively, what that means is that the states have control over the development and exploitation of minerals. Now, given the fact that Australia is such an important minerals exporter, this gives the state governments significant constitutional power. And it means that those minerals-rich states, I'm thinking particularly of Queensland and Western Australia, have gained more power economically with globalisation particularly in the last 25 or 30 years. So that has created some interesting federal-state conflicts, especially in relation to the distribution of tax income and also to a whole range of other federal economic policy issues.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Ramle. Could you please nominate a particular year as a turning point in Australia's relations with the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, I suppose there are 2 or 3 years that come to mind. I mean, the most important year from that point of view, I would suggest, is the year of 1973. And I say 1973 is an important turning point for 3 main reasons. Firstly, 1973 was the year in which Britain finally managed to get into Europe. And what that meant was, well, I guess 2 things, really, from an Australian point of view. 2 of them, of course, are interrelated. One thing meant that, of course, Britain retreated into Europe. Its economic connections with Australia were relatively disrupted in terms of trade, particularly as a result of that. And at the same time, what it meant was that Australia, for the first time in its history, began to think in terms of its own brand of regionalism. In a sense, UK retreating into European regionalism meant that Australia had to look for its own regionalism. And it tended to begin to look for its own regionalism, where already economic linkages were beginning to develop rapidly, which of course was with Northeast Asia in particular. So Britain's entry into Europe in 1973, I think, was a significant event from the point of view of Australia's conscious linkages, more conscious linkages with the Asia-Pacific region. I think a second reason why 1973 was important is associated with Australia's image. And I think the image of Australia as a white racist state is still something which resonates to some degree around Asia, and to some extent has inhibited Australia's linkages and better linkages with Asia. 1973 was important from that point of view because it represented the formal end of Australia's White Australia policy. So I think that was an important turning point in 1973 as well. And I think at the same time, the third point I would make is that not only was 1973 the formal end of Australia's White Australia policy, but it also marked the beginnings of Australia's multicultural policy. And what that meant was, of course, greater recognition of non-British immigrants within Australia. What it also meant was that if you look at the history of immigration into Australia from 1973, the number of immigrants coming in from Asia into Australia began to increase significantly. So all of those three taken together, I think, were important collectively in marking out 1973 as an important year in Australia's linkages with the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, Professor Wembley. You will agree with me if I ask you that, the Cold War years, whether India or Australia have, the certain amount of, the tension, and always the regional tensions, the regional Cold War, and also internationally, the Cold War between the America and the former USSR had impact on other countries. But in this context, I want to ask you, as far as Australia is concerned, its foreign policy, how truly the Australia is conducting its independent foreign policy. Could you please explain?
Yeah, that issue of Australian independent foreign policy is certainly one which has been much debated in Australia. I mean, some authorities argue that from a traditional security perspective, Australia has always been dependent on the world's foremost economic power for its security, to guarantee its security. It's been argued, for example, that Australia was dependent for its traditional security on the United Kingdom up until the beginning of the Pacific War in 1941, when that dependency was taken over by the United States. So the argument has been put by some that Australia has been always dependent upon, first the United Kingdom up to 1941, secondly the United States from 1941 to the end of the Cold War period. And I guess there are many who've suggested and who've argued that, well, at the end of the Cold War, why should Australia continue to be dependent upon the United States? Certainly during the Cold War period, Australia was host to a number of so-called joint facilities scattered around the country. Some of those facilities still remain. And throughout that Cold War period, all of those facilities certainly were nuclear targets on the part of the former Soviet Union. But with the end of the Cold War period, it's felt that maybe only one or two of these facilities, particularly Pine Gap near Alice Springs, as a major international telecommunications base, is probably the one that will continue to be the most important one to continue to operate in the post-Cold War period. So I would say to some extent the end of the Cold War marked a lessening of the American presence in Australia, but to another extent, to some extent, with the onset of globalization and with the increase in so-called non-state security threats, and also with the current policies of the current the current federal government in Australia, it's been felt by some that in fact the relationship with the United States has become stronger, and that rather than, however, the word dependence being used, the word mutual, or the phrase mutual cooperation, is now a phrase which is being used. So from a traditional security dependence point of view, certainly the UK, the United States, and in terms of, however, the economic security points of view, of course, if you look at the shift in economic linkages between Australia and Europe and between Australia and Asia, in the pre-Second World War period, of course, Australia was essentially economically dependent upon the United Kingdom, more than 50% of imports and exports with the UK. But if you look at the situation now, in 2004, that situation has changed fundamentally. About 50% of Australia's exports now go to Northeast Asia. So in terms of economic security, our economic security has shifted fundamentally away from Europe and to Northeast Asia. So Northeast Asia has now supplanted, if you like, Western Europe in terms of economic security. So the way that I would currently see Australia's geopolitical situation is in a sense in a kind of trilateral geopolitical dilemma, what I call a trilateral geopolitical tension between a kind of cultural dimension which is European, an economic dimension which is Asian or which is Northeast Asian, and a traditional security dimension which is American. And those three elements of a trilateral geopolitical tension will move in terms of their relationship one with the other, depending on the political orientation of the federal government. The current federal government favours a tilt towards the United States. The opposition, I'd suggest, favours a stronger tilt towards Asia.
I think after understanding, in detail about the independent conduct of foreign policy, I think it's very important to focus our discussion something on the globalization, especially in the post-Cold War. How the globalization process has impacted on Australia's foreign relations. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, well, I guess I started to do some of that in the previous answer, but I guess I would sort of crystallize that in two or three ways. Particularly, I would suggest that with globalization, what it has meant, among other things, is that in terms of security, we've seen, if you like, a kind of a globalization of terror. It was always felt, when I'm thinking particularly of the security reports that came out of Australia in the mid-1980s. One of those, written by a fairly influential scholar at ANU, who still is there, Professor Paul Dibb, argued in that report in 1986 that Australia was one of the most secure countries on the face of the earth. And he argued that Australia was one of the most secure countries on the face of the earth because it was relatively removed in terms of distance from the major regions of the world conflict. It was surrounded by fairly large expanses of ocean, which made it very difficult to attack. And it was also a very large state, and the populations were scattered around in the southern part, and so that created problems from the point of view of any state invader. And I suppose, in addition, Dibb argued that really the capability, the military capability of states in Australia's immediate region, what Dibb referred to as Australia's region of primary strategic interest, within that region, the military capability of those states, and I'm talking about states in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, those states, the capability of those states was relatively small, and hence there was no immediate or even foreseeable military threat. However, that analysis in 1986 or 1987, the subsequent defence report that came out after it in 1987, was built on a kind of if you like, a kind of realist view of security, to oversimplify the realist view that essentially threats are from other states, and that those threats are primarily military threats. Of course, with globalization, Australia is no longer remote from any major area of conflict, because, of course, terrorism is a non-state threat. And I guess the nature of globalization and the nature of security threats have changed such that no longer are we into a kind of a state-state confrontation in terms of potential conflict, but we're talking about a whole range of threats which have occurred in terms of terrorism, in terms of people smuggling, in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of money laundering, a whole range of things which are now global threats, which are non-state specific threats. And I think in terms of those threats, Australia has become much more vulnerable as a result of globalization. And what that, I think, also implies is that there needs to be a new form of security thinking on the part of the Australian defence planners, which involves greater regional cooperation with regional states, among other things, rather than the nature of dependence upon either the UK or the United States.
At the end, I request Professor Wembley to conclude very briefly the focusing his discussion on Australia's regional relations. Could you please just speak for about 2 minutes?
Okay. Let me take it from 2 points of view. Firstly, the traditional security point of view, and then secondly, the economic point of view, if I could just spend a minute on each perhaps. In terms of traditional security, what I've already said in terms of the nature of threats, Paul Dibb in 1986 referred to Australia's region of primary strategic interest, and this was the arc which incorporated all of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific states. If you look at the total area of that, it's about 10% of the Earth's surface. That region of primary strategic interest 20 years since DIB has now become an arc of instability. It's become an arc of instability within which there are a number of failed or quasi-failed states. There are a number of secessionist movements. There are states which are bankrupt. There are problems of governance and so on and so on. So Australia is now faced in its most immediate region with a number of very important strategic issues to deal with. In terms of economic linkages, our economic linkages with Northeast Asia continue to grow rapidly, although our exports to Japan have fallen off in the last few years, partly related to the Japanese economic crisis, but that will change over the next several years. But one thing that has certainly begun to change as well is the practical implementation of Australia's Look West policy. I think for far too long, Australia-India relations have been the subject of neglect, certainly on the part of the Australian government. And I think what we've seen in more recent years is the beginnings of a real Look West policy in addition to the other issues that I've just mentioned. And I would suggest that over the next decade that Australia-India relations, both in economic terms and in security and other cooperative terms, cooperation across a whole range of issues to do with the ocean, to do with sea lanes of security, to do with other matters of security, provide a very firm basis for stronger cooperation between Australia and India over the next decade.
Thank you very much, Professor Ambly, for a academically very mature discussion on Australia's political system and foreign relations. And friends, thank you once again for giving this opportunity to deliver a very, very thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.